Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Reigns. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Reigns have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Reigns are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Reigns website at praetorreigns.co.uk/liberal-democrats. Now, on with the podcast.
Actually, I don't think this has got a bar chart.
What?
I mean, to be fair, in Liverpool, who else are you squeezing?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. The Arthur Scargill party or something like that.
Yeah.
We move on to March. Not little things that happened, but other things that happened that you might have missed. Harvey Weinstein went to prison. Everyone can agree that's a good thing.
Temporarily.
There we go. Absolutely brilliant. Boris Johnson ended up in intensive care. That was an odd moment in British politics, I would say. Was that the point when COVID became really real for people? Because the full lockdown happened on the 23rd of March. The stock markets crashed really badly on the 9th of March. It was their worst ever day drop in their history. And of course, local elections got cancelled. So March is when it happened. But we can go through, you don't have to restrict yourself to what happened in March. So we'll get onto the COVID topic. From March right the way till now, I mean, I put out in a tweet, I don't think the government handled any part of this pandemic particularly well, which makes me very nervous for how they're going to handle a vaccine rollout. But that was the start of it. So has politics changed because of COVID? Have the Lib Dems done right by COVID? And have we been too soft on it? Have we given the government an easy ride? We talked right the way through this process as a podcast about getting the type of message right, not being overtly political and in your face. But with the government making so many mistakes, have we collectively as Lib Dems not been aggressive enough in criticising? Discuss.
I think there's been a real lack of appetite from the public for politicians throwing bricks at one another. And I think we hear it all the time. Why can't you all just work together to get stuff done, outside a pandemic? And in a pandemic, those calls were even louder. So did we get it right? I think we would have looked shrill and ludicrous had we been baying for blood while the Prime Minister was in intensive care. That would have been wrong on so many levels. Have we pointed out enough of the mistakes? I think probably, but we've got 11 MPs, and so we don't get the call from BBC Breakfast to be the voice saying, well, we haven't really done this properly. Yes, schools should stay closed or open or whatever. Even when we've been saying some of the same things that somebody else will say a couple of weeks later and then get in the news, it's what happens when you have 11 MPs, which is why it's important all of us involved in the party and involved in getting stuff done we all use the opportunities we've got. So we all write letters to the paper, or we put something on the local Facebook group where appropriate, or email the people on our list, because we can't just leave it to the 3 people in the press team at HQ.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think the only thing we possibly could have done differently, and you can make the case both ways. So it's something where, you kind of think about with hindsight is if we could have picked a relatively, I think what we've tried to do is kind of come up with a kind of moderate position that's focused on the staggering government incompetence rather than kind of necessarily going in sort of super critical at all times. But I think perhaps the only thing we could have done might have been to kind of go hard on some of the sort of pick a small number of issues and go hard on those issues rather than trying to comment on kind of all of the different twists and turns. And I think the one that stands out for me is probably sick pay, where the issue of our kind of woefully inadequate sick pay has just not really been discussed very much throughout the pandemic, and actually it's probably one of the things that's driving failure to self-isolate. And it's one of the things the party did quite successfully on the excluded, is but it, made a really big drive on people who've been excluded from furlough support. And I wonder if I think the only thing so I think the only thing I wonder in our response is whether whether we could have kind of potentially both had more cut through and also had a greater impact on how the pandemic has developed by kind of going harder on a smaller range of issues. But you can argue that both ways, so it's not something that I kind of feel particularly inclined to nitpick the leadership.
I think that our parliamentary team have done very well. When you consider that Munira was only elected about 3 months before this pandemic struck, and I speak to her very, very regularly, as I speak to Sal Brinton, the way that they have actually consistently put forward very high quality opinions, often at very short notice. We've helped with that, of course, but magnificent teamwork. I think the difficulty has been, though, that the government has consistently overpromised and under-delivered. And I think back to the first mistake they made. They were going to get 100,000 tests done every day. And the only way they achieved it was sending out about 70,000 tests in the post, most of which didn't come back. So they just said, look, we're going to try and get to 100,000. We don't really know what's happening here. Certainly in the early days, until the Cummings event, which I suspect we're going to talk about separately, there was a lot of goodwill for them, because none of us would have got it right. They continue to make the same sorts of mistakes. Telling Greenwich Council in December they had to reopen the schools, and then 2 days later saying it's quite likely we're going to stagger schools coming back. And there has been an announcement in the last hour, and I don't know what it is, about a further delay. This was blindingly obvious. Why did they stick their ground when it was quite obvious they'd have to move it? And this has nothing to do with the new variant. So if they'd have been more honest with people, saying it's a bloody difficult job to do, these are the options, this is what we've got to consider, they'd have a lot more support now. But frankly, most people I meet think they've just screwed up the whole of the coronavirus debate. And they haven't got everything right by any means. Their perception is that they've been really bad on it.
I think there was a reasonable amount of sort of generosity, to the government sort of when it all kicked off. I mean, I don't think any of us would have been been like to have been in charge of that particular response. Early days, certainly no envy there that we weren't the ones running the country. And so I think we took the right approach. And I think that as public opinion has turned, and as Richard says, they just keep on making the same mistakes. I read a newspaper article the other day that basically said the problem isn't that Boris Johnson makes mistakes, because every leader's making mistakes during this crisis. The problem is that he seems incapable of learning from those mistakes. And I think, as time has gone on, we've called them out on that more and more and more. And I think that feels a lot more reasonable now than it would have done if we started baying for blood in March, April. Would have been inappropriate, and that certainly reflects what we've done at a local level. So we haven't gone as far as some opposition groups as kind of like signing joint letters and not done that. It's it's your COVID response, Steve, you can own it, that's absolutely fine. But we've supported quietly, we've not been antagonistic, we've not sort of try to make things harder. And then, when it got to the end of July and we still hadn't had a virtual council meeting, and it was very clear that this was going to go on for the foreseeable future, we started stirring up a fuss and, started making some noise and got those meetings reinstated, to the extent that when we went into the November lockdown, life at the council didn't change for me at all, because we still, everything was continuing. Things just rolled on. So I think that's been the right response. I think, to pick up on something that Laura said, we can't control our media cut through. It's something that's sort of out of our hands, really. But I do think there have been a couple of issues. Jamie Stone has been particularly vocal on the self-employed excluded campaign. Whether he's got the cut through on that he should have done, is up for debate. But we've certainly been on, even if we haven't had the media sort of cut through at the time, I think we've been, if you like, on the right side of the argument. I think we've spoken up for the things that have mattered, things like support for the self-employed, which is still massively, massively lacking. Obviously Ed's campaign around support for carers, I think, is just as relevant during the pandemic as at other times. And all we can, as Lisa says, we've got 11 MPs. All we can do is sort of amplify that. But I think worse than not getting coverage for speaking up on the right things would be getting coverage for being shrill and difficult and antagonistic at a time of national crisis.
So when I was looking through this, there are a couple of things that just came to me. So in March and in February, we had on that the list about things that happened this year. Let's not forget that Matt Hancock did announce that they were fully prepared. So, but at that point, if we think about February, it was still, COVID was still, it was, to me, it was like, it was in the news and it was kind of going everywhere but it still didn't seem real. And I remember it was probably going to be early March. I was in the tram going into Manchester and someone coughed. And normally that would just be, but you could just tell the whole mood, the whole tram just changed. It was like everyone was looking around and it was probably about a week later, I got into the office and my boss was there and he was like, pack up. We've been told, everyone's got to go. And it was around then when the local elections were called off as well. And John, you were the last person to have visited our house as well, because you came and did the podcast on that week as well. And then the weird thing is, on the 18th of March, I remember this, the 18th of March was my first day of working from home. And I know that because it was also the day that Carla got her British citizenship. And she was the last person to have her citizenship at Stockport Town Hall. And we turned up and there was no one there. The clerk didn't really know what was going on or how they were supposed to act. We didn't know how we were supposed to act. We ended up going for a drink, a celebratory drink in Stockport, but it was dead. And it was so weird. That whole thing was just so weird. But we kept on being told by the government that they were prepared. They knew what was going on. It was, Richard's absolutely spot on. There was an element of people who were willing to be generous and give them the benefit of the doubt, but they kept on over-promising. And let's not forget that that we were told at the beginning of March as well that there would be a protective ring around care homes. And the way the care home sector, the way care homes have been treated by this government has just been appalling, which has then ended up with Amnesty doing a report on human rights abuses by our government to those residents in care homes. And I don't think enough has been made of that. And I think there is going to be a time and place, and there has to be an inquiry into this. But I think what we will find that will come out, particularly around care homes, is not only were the government underprepared, but they were negligent. And I think we will find that people's lives were put at risk tragically because of the way our government didn't act and our government made decisions which put people in harm's way. And they
literally sent people home out of hospitals to the care homes.
Exactly,
they literally cleared the hospitals out into the care homes. I mean,
and then and that's before we even start going into the way do not resuscitate notices were being signed without people knowing. That absolutely disgraceful. Yeah.
This podcast has been sponsored by the Katora Coffee Club, the UK's most environmentally friendly coffee club. There are over 400 independent roasters in the UK, each one crafting coffee in their own unique style. Katora Coffee Club works with some of the best to take you on a voyage of coffee discovery. The Katora Coffee Club delivers ethically sourced and independently roast coffee directly to your door. Each month you'll receive between 2 and 4 bags of coffee and their monthly extract magazine. All Katora Coffee Club boxes are carbon negative and offset the CO2, so why not do some good, enjoy some great coffee and check out the website www.katoracoffeeclub.com. Now, back to the podcast.
One of the staggering decisions, the decisions that I just find just completely incomprehensible, was that in early March, as late as early March, when we knew that there was sort of tons of COVID going around in the UK, doctors were banned from testing people in hospital who had COVID symptoms unless they had travelled to somewhere like Italy or were a contact of a confirmed COVID case. So you had people coming in being like, oh, this is an awfully funny cough. But they weren't allowed to test people. So you had people coming on TV being like, well, we have no evidence of community transmission. Well, it's like, well, of course you bloody don't, because you're banning people from testing for community transmission. And just then making decisions on the basis of data which anyone sane must have known was fundamentally flawed. I mean, I find that just one of the hardest decisions to understand. And then you think about the sort of huge numbers of health worker deaths that we saw, particularly early on in the pandemic, because people were treating people who had this awfully funny type of pneumonia on wards, knowing that the person probably had COVID, but having been banned from testing for it. And, you know, we've had, I think the latest figures were 650 healthcare workers have died as a result, you know, from COVID. And now they won't all have caught it at work, but a lot of them have. And, you know, a lot of that happened very early on. And it wasn't all the people in the kind of highest risk jobs, you know, actually treating the COVID patients. It was the people who were treating the people who were coming in for all kinds of other things and were just sitting on wards with this awfully funny type of cough. And that's just, you know, it's just horrifying. And you think, you know, the same about bus drivers, teachers, police, all of these people in these exposed professions who were knowingly put at risk for weeks by people who were not, well, I mean, actually, as it turned out, they were all at risk, because it turned out that Westminster was full of COVID and they were all going around shaking hands with COVID patients in hospital. But actually, they didn't have to be at risk. That was their choice. And other people didn't have that choice. And that's, you know, it's one of the decisions that I just find hardest to understand, that kind of failure to think about testing earlier on and the kind of real human consequences that we've seen of that. Both in terms of, you know, the direct consequences in terms of deaths and in terms of the terrible decision making that came on the back of that shonky data. And yeah, and we've been paying the price for that really ever since. And it's you know, very, very wage inducing and very hard to forgive. And I mean, we recently passed a milestone as well. I'm not sure if it was kind of widely reported, to be honest, because I've taken a bit of a social media break, so I just haven't been as on top of the news over Christmas. But we're now at the point where I think 0.1% of our population has died of COVID, which, you know, is, you know, it's a meaningful percentage of British people have died as a result of this disease. And, you know, every time the government has made a late decision, that price has been paid in the cost of hundreds or thousands of lives, and that has added up.
If you put it another way that we understand, almost the equivalent of the electors in a parliamentary constituency have now died of COVID. But when the inquiry's done, we mustn't assume it all started going wrong in 2020. We've got to assume it all started going wrong in 2017, when a comprehensive testing exercise was done on our readiness for a pandemic. And it could be any pandemic, and it could have been a worse pandemic than the one we've had. This is bad enough. And the government totally ignored findings that they need to have more PPE in place. They needed to recognise that the people most at risk were elderly in care homes. It was quite clear from the pandemic that it was the public health consequences of the NHS that would cause deaths, because the people dying were obese, suffering from alcoholism, recovering or not from drug abuse. So all these things were known in 2017, except we did nothing about them.
It's interesting. I think the phrase, you can have sympathy for people going into a crisis. you quickly lose it if they're making mistakes going through it. And I think that's what happened. I mean, the government was found really lacking. And I think the thing that gets me most is about the delaying of decisions, because it looks like they were looking at optics. How will this look if we close down the shops at this particular time? Instead of thinking, actually, and I was very fortunate to go to Taiwan a couple of years ago. They have had 30 deaths total in Taiwan. That is it. In a place that has a huge population right next to the epicenter of where this disease started. And they have cracked down because they just said, look, we know how to deal with this. It's going to be uncomfortable, but you act quickly and you act decisively. Now, what the government didn't do, in my opinion, is they delayed far too much because they were worried about how it would look. And this whole thing about overpromising has a really negative effect as well. If, like I say, they overpromised about PPE, about testing, about care homes, about lockdown, all this stuff they overpromised about the app. Can you remember, we're going to have an app by June. It wasn't working till September. Absolutely. And you talk about test and trace.
Wasn't working in September either.
Yeah, and just last week, I had a friend of mine who was diagnosed with COVID. Absolutely fine, no problem. They were contacted 4 times by test and trace. Brilliant. And then got a snotty thing saying, if they didn't get in contact with test and trace, we might check you up in your home to make sure you are actually isolating, because test and trace apparently had no record of any of the conversations they'd already have. This is it. And then you bring into the stuff about the cronyism, and so where some of these contracts have gone, it just stinks. And so, like I say, you can have a lot of sympathy going into a crisis, but they have made so many gargantuan mistakes, and then spun it as like, stiff upper lip, Brits will get through it. And it's like, no, people are dying. My dad nearly died of this thing. You've got to do better than what you are. And that's what makes me really worried about this vaccine rollout. They've got to get this right. They have had time to prepare. If they get this wrong, there is no excuse. They knew this vaccine was coming. But we're only in April. And it's interesting because April, Boris said we were past the peak. Again, over-optimistic nonsense. But one big political change that happened in April was the election of Keir Starmer. Now let's talk about Labour. Labour from Keir's election right the way through to today. So I think most people are glad Corbyn's gone. I don't think anyone's going to object to that from any side of the Lib Dems. I think most people are happy that Corbyn's gone because he made getting Lib Dems elected pretty difficult. Okay, let's go to you first, Laura, because you were in probably the only winnable parliamentary seat we might get against Labour. So what has Keir's election, how have Labour fared since Keir got elected in April?
I mean, look, it's kind of obviously difficult to say because in terms of how it's gone down with the public, because I just haven't been on doors as much as I normally would be because of the pandemic. But I think if we look at what's happening in the opinion polls, I mean, it's very clear, and just the general narrative around Labour that it has been a boost for them. He's been much more effective than Corbyn would have been in terms of holding the government to account, and I think that's something he deserves credit for, although it is admittedly quite a low bar. But he has done, a good job of holding the government to account on some of their failings, and he's also responded sort of on the anti-Semitism report with a sort of appropriate level of seriousness. I think there are a lot of criticisms, however, that can be made, and I think that if Labour don't start to take some of that on board, then some of the government's criticisms will start to land. So the government's been going very hard on this sort of Captain Hindsight, Mr. Indecisive type narrative. And what we know about these kind of labels is that they don't, the public's got a decent instinct for this stuff, is pretty fair-minded, and they don't stick unless people think that there's something to them. And I think with Labour, there is a real risk that they will start to stick and that people will start to see something, something to them. And I think he's done a lot of the right things, but if I were in their position, I would be a bit concerned that he's been a bit timid on some issues. And I think there's also a lot of hard questions that have been dodged. And I think the biggest one for me is around the anti-Semitism report. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. You know, the question that Starmer hasn't really answered is that, well, actually, if you are as appalled by all of this as you say you are, what were you doing in Jeremy Corbyn's front bench for the last 2 years? Either you didn't see it, in which case you're culpable, or you did see it and you decided to stay put anyway, in which case you're also culpable. What have you got to say about it? And I think that is an important question, and one that he may have an answer to it, but it's one that I do hope we'll come back to.
I'm not the most avid watcher of the news, I have to say. I generally find the best way to protect my mental health is just to not watch it. But I'm sort of struggling to think of what Keir Starmer has done at all, really, since he's been elected. I mean, he's not been Jeremy Corbyn, which is obviously a good thing. And I was quite entertained by the way he just sort of cheerfully kicked Jeremy Corbyn out of the party, and then when the party let him back in, went, yeah, but you're not sitting in my parliamentary party, mate. I thought that was mildly entertaining. But other than that, it's just been really quite beige, hasn't he, to be honest? You know, I mean, I don't know if it's a strategy, you know, just there's a global pandemic, let's just keep our head down, you know, lots of years till the next general election, or if Keir Starmer is just really quite beige. I suspect there's a bit of both. And I mean, you know, today, I know I'm jumping ahead some months here. Labour have voted for Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. I mean, you know, like, what's the first rule of opposition? Like, vote against the government's ideas. You know, it's just bog basic opposition, isn't it? You know, and yes, I appreciate he lost lots and lots of red wall seats to the Conservatives over Brexit, but you know, you don't vote with the government when you're in opposition. It's just, and particularly not when they've got a majority of 80. You know, it's not like the House is perched on a knife edge and this thing was going to go through or fall on Labour votes. You know, I find that entirely perplexing. I take great pleasure as opposition in voting against everything, because that's, you know, that's the point, isn't it? That's, you know, that's your job. Yeah, just beige, isn't he? What's he done? And the difficulty is, you know, we're not out on the doorsteps, we've not had the opportunity to get out and, you know, and talk to my voters about how they feel about him. They will all be very relieved he's not Jeremy Corbyn, but he's going to have to, you know, they've got a majority of 80 to overturn next time. They're going to have to do better than just not being Jeremy Corbyn. It's just not enough.
I think that's exactly what I was trying to, that's a much better way of putting what I was trying to say, really. Is like, is he beige, or is it a tactic? And we'll find out in the next year or so. And if he is, it's not going to be enough.
So there are a few things he clearly had to do off the bat. So one, not be Jeremy Corbyn, which he has succeeded in being Jeremy Corbyn, so much so that Jeremy Corbyn is no longer sitting as a Labour MP. It was obvious as well that they needed to do something about anti-Semitism, and they needed to try to move beyond Brexit as they see it. They don't want to talk about Brexit, and they don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. So they need to get in front of those early on in this parliament. For me, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner as his deputy have been much more managerial, I think, than I was expecting. But if you think about how we as a party cope after a general election and some of the processes we need to go through, and when you have a new leader, just think about that bunch of rats in the sack that is the Labour Party and the process of change they need to go through, bearing in mind who has been in charge and who has been chairing committees, who has been the General Secretary, who's been doing all this stuff, who's been in power for the last however many years Corbyn was in power for, I guess, and moving to this. They've had so much work to do within their own party that the fact that they've kept most of it out of the press, I think, is probably a success for them, because they've had to do a lot of change. So for me, yes, of course, he's beige, but actually for the Labour voters or Labour-minded voters in Hazel Grove, that's all right. Beige is probably all right. The fact that he's just not terrifying is step one, whereas Corbyn was genuinely terrifying for some Tory voters who couldn't imagine just couldn't imagine him as Prime Minister, and they weren't on their own. It's for him to be sort of competent, not terrifying, is enough for big chunks of voters that we need to be more relaxed than they were last time.
So it's not going to win back Scotland for Labour. It's not going to do. I mean, it absolutely is a tactic to say, keep your head down, watch the Tories rip themselves apart. That was kind of the plan, in the sense that Michael Howard did the same thing with the Tories, in terms of he wasn't particularly effective as an opposition leader. He had just allowed Labour to rip itself apart under the final years of Brown and Blair. So I think that's just a tactic they're doing at the moment. But the problem is it eventually comes to a crunch where what do you do? And I'm really enjoying this Beyond the Red Wall book I'm reading at the moment about why the Tories won in those seats, and it deals with Darlington, Accrington, and Stoke in particular, and it's really insightful. And Labour aren't going to, like I said, Labour are not going to win 124 seats next time round. There's something dramatic, and I'm not sure the Tories, as much as a pandemic is going to hurt them, that's going to hurt them that much to do it. So Labour have got to do something different if they're going to get back in, and they can't do it without Scotland. So I don't know where they go and whether and how Keir deals with that going forward is going to be the thing. But Richard, you've been fighting Labour longer than all of us. The 1906 elections was a tough one, but no, that was a great one. Beg your pardon. Their emergence was scary. But so you are usually locked in battle with Labour. I mean, we've just seen your latest tabloid. You showed us before this went live. You are not shy about punching at Labour. There we go. Luckily, the Liverpool Labour Party give you plenty of ammunition. And I think that's one thing we should say to Lib Dems everywhere. At the moment, Ed Davies made it clear he is not punching at Keir Starmer nationally. Lib Dems locally absolutely should. I have a very incompetent Labour administration here in Preston. Hannah will say the same thing in Barnsley. You would say the same thing in Liverpool. Lib Dem activists need to know that whatever colour the council is, our job is to be good opposition. And then hopefully in Lisa and Tom's thing, good ruling parties in the near future. Oh, hang on. Phrase of the year, Richard. You're on mute.
My perspective is that the Labour Party have moved from being something that's totally unacceptable, i.e. Cornbynism, and have become something totally unacceptable, which is 1960s, 1970s statism. Because as the Corbynites leave, you're left with all the people who believe in nationalisation, that the council can do everything, that council houses are the only way to provide decent accommodation for people. Their instincts are probably absolutely right. I don't disagree with them on wanting to do things for the poor, provide people with decent housing, but their methods of doing it are so old-fashioned. At the end of the day, they are grossly incompetent. We'll be breaking a story in Liverpool tomorrow, or it might be today when you put this out, John. There are 39 stalled major property developments in Liverpool because of the way Labour ran the regeneration department of the city and who they attracted. I am not going to not have a go against the Labour Party. What we said in Liverpool was there are two issues on which we wouldn't have a go at the Labour Party. One was coronavirus, and the second was the current state of the finances. Not they haven't made mistakes over the years, but today it's such a major problem for all of us that we said we'd work with them on those two issues. Everything else is fair game. And you'll have seen from that newspaper, which has started to go out yesterday, I'm sure every Liberal Democrat is already back on the doorsteps delivering leaflets. We will hold Labour to account in Liverpool because they're dreadful.
Is it worth saying, just for people who are listening to this as a podcast rather than watching it on YouTube, that Richard held up at the beginning a very, very punchy tabloid with the headline, Labour Mayor Arrested, which was, of course, referring to the arrest of the... So hang on, you're going to have to remind me which of your three mayors it is.
Yeah. The elected mayor.
The elected mayor.
The elected city mayor. Even I get confused about this.
So the elected city mayor was, of course, arrested for, on suspicion of corruption.
Bribery and witness intimidation.
And it was fairly gentle by Liverpool Lib Dem standards, I have to say. It was understated, it was subtle.
Do you want to see the back page? This is a whole... I mean, it goes back to, I felt slightly guilty before when Hannah was going about how we should deal with our opposition. But frankly, when the elected mayor who created the electoral mayoralty for himself gets arrested, and he's the 10th arrest in Liverpool of people connected with the council in 3 years, I am not going to go lightly on that one, I'm afraid.
No. I'd say Liverpool truly is the Chicago of British politics, isn't it?
Who am I? Button it, Morrison. We're not having an answer.
I mean, for all viewers that don't know, one of the legendary pieces of literature that I remember was the Liverpool Lib Dems put a monopoly board out of various bad goings on in there we go. That's right. Playing monopoly with your council tax. If you ever want to see inventive literature, look at the Liverpool Lib Dems. But we're going to move on, okay? Because we've talked about opposition, and we're going into May and June now. And so we came out, there's two things that happened to the government standing, which they probably weren't expecting. The first was the U-turn on extending the free school meals. And that became massive. And particularly, and then it came up later on with Marcus Rashford as well, about that government U-turn. And again, this is a little sense of the government not having a grasp of the detail. That cabinet in particular being very light and pretty, well, crap. If I'm going to say, they were brought in because they were loyal, not because of talent. And so that came up, and then it culminated in May with the Dominic Cummings incident. And I think that was a point where we've talked about sympathy, where everyone just went, hang on. It's one rule for one. The only ring of protection we're talking about, it wasn't around care homes, it was about Dominic Cummings. He was the only person that got the ring of protection. So Lisa, from your point of view, what did that do for the Tories' whole strategy of communications?
It was not a good moment. So if you look at the data about public engagement with the process, public compliance with the regulations and the rules, the 2 points at which there were big dips were Dominic Cummings and when there started to be changes in rules. So people didn't know about the tiers or understand the changes that were coming. And they were the 2 big dips. There was really high compliance in the first lockdown. And most people, most of the time, want to stick to the rules, want to do the right thing, want to stick to the rules. As things get more complicated and they can't see the logic of, okay, I can go to my mum's house on Christmas Day, but not stay over, but we've already been sharing all of our particles all day. That doesn't make sense. But the big dip, the biggest dip, has been the Dominic Cummings incident. And the ludicrous scenes of cabinet ministers saying, well, yes, from time to time, I have gone for a drive to test my eyesight, was just, I mean, it was embarrassing as well as shameful. The whole thing will have cost people's lives because exactly as you say, one rule for them, one rule for us. If he doesn't need to do it, why do I not need to do it? And it just went on and on and on. And they circled the wagons, exactly as you said, trying to protect him. We need the protective wall around Dominic Cummings. And it was just, they should all be ashamed.
And I think we're really seeing that in people's level of compliance. I think we've seen polling saying that only 20% of people self-isolate when they're told to. I was at the playground this morning with my daughter, and there was somebody next to me at the slides talking about how she'd been asked to self-isolate 2 days earlier and was just, out at the playground with her kids. So obviously I was kind of edging away rapidly. And people are just ignoring it. And, I've got quite a lot of sympathy for some of the people who are ignoring it because they need to go to work because they don't have access to sick pay. But we're not talking about those people. We're talking about people, who are presumed, off work between Christmas and New Year, taking their kids to the playground, potentially spreading COVID. And where does that come back to? As Lisa says, people might not remember that they're doing it because of Dominic Cummings and what that showed them about their need to obey the rules. But that's the point where people shifted and stopped listening to the rules and started sort of disobeying them in huge numbers. And the result of it is that we have to have stricter and stricter lockdowns for less and less effect, which is hurting everyone.
And of course, we shouldn't just mention Dominic Cummings. We should. I can't quite remember the SNP MP that was so stupid to get onto that train ride. I can't remember what her name was.
Margaret Ferrier.
There we go. Thank you, Lisa, font of all knowledge.
One of her colleagues, I rather enjoyed the way one of her colleagues described her. He says, the thing with Margaret is that she's hard of thinking.
But Cummings was a star. The only other thing that was more annoying was posh Southerners adding so many A's to Barnard Castle or something like that. It's clearly Barnard Castle. You don't have to add extra vowels into the pronunciation of anything.
No, it isn't. Barnard Castle.
Barnard Castle. Okay, sorry. Lord Kemp has spoken again.
Oh, I've gone up a notch.
I thought he was just Sir Kemp.
It's Viceroy and then Emperor after that.